just learned the best spell of all.
What's that?
Sleep.
Welcome back to My Alchemical Bromance. My name is Erik Arneson, and I'm here today with the hosts of the Magician and the Fool podcast, Janice and Dominic. Hi, guys.
What's up?
Hey, Erik.
All right, I really only have one question for you.
Cool.
Which one of you is the magician, and which one is the fool?
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you guys for listening to My Alchemical Bromance.
That was fun, man.
Yeah, this is a great interview. I mean, I really... There's a lot of...
Let's do it again.
Okay, we will. This is great. All right, I thought that was a super clever question.
No. Originally, yeah. I mean, if we want to get into it, originally, Janice was definitely the magician and I was the fool. But it was left kind of open-ended because when I came up with the idea, I thought just that those two cards were pretty interesting as far as the interplay between them. And on a very surface level, I thought it would be kind of funny also that Janice would be the magician, I would be the fool. My idea was that he was more of the expert, and I was going to be kind of play the role of like the student, and where I would be asking questions and that kind of thing. But it's evolved a little bit from there. But that was kind of the original thought.
And plus, everybody has both those sides in them. You know, any magician who doesn't admit to being a fool is a pompous windbag. You know, part of being a magician is understanding that the magician has two faces. One is the magician, and one is a fool. So, I'm a total fool, and half the time, and then half the time I want someday. Half of the time I'm hoping that someday I might be able to become a real magician.
I would totally agree with that. I mean, I don't think that there's much of a point in being a magician if you already know everything. Right?
Right.
I mean,
Exactly.
part of doing it is exploring.
Right. If you're going to be a magician, that means you have to continually be open to being the fool, because it's there's always going to be new experiences that you're going to need to be open to, and if you're not, then you're going to stagnate. I mean, you're going to stop. You're going to come to a dead end. So you have to always have that fool mindset, I think.
But then
True.
there's another side to that, which is you also always have to have the magician mindset. Like we see this in the Greek magical papyri, where sometimes when you're confronting spirits or doing rituals, you have to stand up there and be like, I'm the greatest thing that's ever lived. I'm Solomon, king of Israel, or I'm Apollonius of Tyana, and listen to me, I'm super important. You have to kind of encompass or embody both archetypes.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you have to be Solomon, King Solomon. Sometimes you have to be Solomon Grundy. You know what I mean?
Born on a Monday.
You know what I mean? Yeah. but the thing is, I mean, think about it. For instance, consider Norse in the northern way, or the Norse myths. Odin and Loki are really an inseparable pair. In most of the myths, they travel together, and they have nearly identical skills and abilities. I mean, they're clearly both magicians, and Loki may play the fool, or play the fool guy, or fall guy, or scapegoat, but he's essentially as much of a magician as Odin, and that goes for Coyote, the trickster, or Raven. These fire-bearing culture heroes are frequently magicians that have a demiurgic function. So, there's really, I think it's more a question of mode, because the magician introduces order into a chaotic system in order to set it into motion, and then the fool introduces chaos into an ordered system to cause it to continue to grow and to help to avoid stagnation. So I think that they're they're two modalities of a functional practitioner that are both essential.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but I really like that point of view. That makes a lot of sense. And I also like that comparison between like Loki and Thor, because I always think of my favorite story of them is when they go to the castle of Utgard Loki. You know, where they have to.
I love that.
Yeah, where they have the whole thing where they sneak in, and Utgard Loki himself, who's not Loki, he's a bad guy. He's a trickster, you know? He's like this giant, huge, monstrous trickster who like disguises himself as a mountain, or disguises himself as like an old lady, or he does all these things to sort of like fool Thor and Loki, and what the heck was their little dude, their little sidekick? Can't remember what his name was.
Is that the one where Thor had to drink like an ocean's worth of beer or something crazy?
Yeah, where he drinks. He has a giant drinking horn, and he takes a huge drink out of it. And when he stops, it's only gone down like an inch. And the giants are all terrified. The Jotnar are all terrified because afterwards they're like, "Oh, that was connected to the sea, and you made the sea, the world round, decrease by a foot." Yeah, and now we've got global warming. We're basically undoing Thor's draft.
The silver
Well,
line.
I think the Thor-Loki dynamic is interesting too. For me, I more see Odin as a magician rather than Thor. But I do love that story, and I also personally I think if Loki can if he can shift his shape to almost anything, and if he can become a woman, a female, as a horse,
and give birth,
children, then he could also bilocate, and because he's already half giant, according to some narratives, fully giant. It depends on what you read. Utgard Loki just means Loki of Utgard.
But but didn't even Loki lost a contest, right? I can't remember what his contest was. Was it eating or running or something like that? Like there was he ended up.
I believe it. I think it was maybe. Was it eating?
It was eating because whoever he was in the eating contest against ended up being fire, like elemental fire disguised.
Right, but that was also a play on Loki's name.
Really?
Loki's name. Yeah, because Loki's name has there's multiple possible etymologies, but one is fire.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, because fire consumes fire burns. So there's the fire of inspiration of like Kanos.
Mm-hmm.
But it can, and then there's the fire of seagull, and fire can illuminate or inspire, but it can also burn, and so it must be controlled. There's a stone which they believe is a fire stone, like it would be put into a fire, like a hearth or fireplace, and it has like holes, I think, in the eyes and mouth, and it shows Loki bound.
Oh.
And so the fire in the stone would have come through the eyes and mouth, like if it was put in the hearth.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah, it's really neat. But yeah, I mean, I think maybe when I was younger, I might have just said, "Oh, I'm a magician," but now, personally, like, I'm wary of calling myself anything, except for maybe fool sometimes, because I just feel so much. The older I get, the more of a student I feel like. The more I see this like wide vista of things I want to learn and learn how to do and know, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It always makes me raise an eyebrow. I think that's the way to go. But it always makes me raise an eyebrow when you see these people speaking in absolutes all the time. A lot of people like to speak in absolutes nowadays. And, as a Star Wars fan, I know that, only Sith speak in absolutes.
True.
But seriously, when you start speaking in absolutes, you definitely have to show that you've got some authority. You're speaking with authority and confidence, but you're closing a door at that point, and I don't know. It's just an odd thing to do to see to be speaking in absolutes and portraying yourself as someone who knows it all, and especially if you're 40 years old, 30 years old.
Yeah.
Oh, you young people. Yeah, I agree. I would say you should try to avoid absolutes, because I mean, who the hell knows everything? Who the hell knows everything about anything? Nobody.
Right. But on the other side, sorry.
No, please, you go.
I was going to say, on the other side, you have to sometimes be able to speak authoritatively about subjects, and you can't always be kind of adding in my opinion, or I think. Although, that would be the best way to do it. I don't know.
Wouldn't you?
No, I think it's true.
I guess I've always thought that it's, an authority, it's easy to trust somebody as an authority if they're willing to admit their ignorance. If they're willing to say, like, I know this thing and this thing, but about this other thing I've got no clue. And that doesn't really provide comfort to the listener, but it definitely, I think, shows honesty and integrity in the speaker.
I definitely appreciate it when I hear that kind of talk.
Well, I think it's important, and I do think it's important to speak with authority on things that you've earned authority in or have studied extensively, especially if they are meaningful to you. If it's a tradition you're operating within in an initiatory capacity or otherwise, if it's something you've practiced diligently for years or studied diligently for years, part of the aspect of living in the age of Mercury that we're in is as much information as there is misinformation and disinformation. And there's a lot of sincere people who are coming to things with pure intentions and genuine interest that are very easily misguided by people who half of them don't realize that they're misguided and misguiding, and the other half do and are deliberately doing so. And so it's also important to be a voice of truth in the wilderness sometimes, because when you acquire power, you also are given responsibility to match the power you're given.
Thanks, Stanley.
And knowledge, and knowledge is power, and power is responsibility.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's totally true. But I think there's also responsibility in the listener. As listeners, as students, and maybe I'm talking to the audience out there, but I think that there's also a responsibility in those who pay attention to the talking heads or whoever's out there claiming any sort of authority. You need to be approaching stuff with a critical eye and a critical ear. Don't just take anybody's word for it. We have untold amounts of information available to us now. Do your own research, look stuff up, learn things, and expand your mind. You're not, when you listen to other people, you shouldn't be listening to them just to adopt them as an authority, but to use them as a point of research, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Don't be lazy. Be your own advocate. This is, in spirituality and philosophy, we're, oftentimes it's said that you're training for death. So, it's kind of a big deal, and you're responsible for your soul, if you want to look at it that way. And do you really want to leave it up to some internet guru, or, do you want to look a little deeper? So, yeah. Well,
personally, I trust Janus because he's got a cool mustache. So if he wants to tell me stuff, I'm in.
You guys are totally outgunning me. You're both twirling those mustaches.
One of those things you learn at higher levels of initiation is that the more you can twirl your mustache, the more the more the voice of God speaks to you in your head.
Right.
It sort of rattles around in there.
building up energy there with that twisting motion.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as soon as I get off this call, I'm going to have like $1 million sorcery course that I'm about to start. I'm going to be set for life.
Well, I've got $1 million sorcery course that, and the link is easier to type.
Well, just make sure you have enough mini workshops that are only $500 for 15 minutes. That'll make you an instant magician.
Oh man,
that's a real thing.
I know it's a real thing.
Culture on and I think we should talk about that for a minute, because it's a problematic culture that's developing. There's these internet magician gurus that are really just swindling people. They provide so much content. This is not what magic is about. Magic is not self-help guru. Magic is not a course you take. This is not how it's done.
It's the work, yeah, and it's a troublesome thing to talk about, especially since we're kind of like doing podcasts, and possibly some of these people have been guests or will be guests on our podcasts. And I think about it a lot. Like, there's one in particular that I know a ton of people who sort of subscribe to their monthly thingamajig that it's kind of nuts. Like, how come we aren't making money that way?
Well, I do want to say that in all honesty, I am definitely jealous of the money that's coming in.
I am too.
But I'm not. I would love to have that money, but playing devil's advocate, because I definitely agree with you guys. Playing devil's advocate, perhaps there is good content. I don't know. I haven't subscribed to any of that stuff, any of them. But I'm open to the possibility that there is good content, and no one's forcing anyone else to pay for anything.
Yeah, that's true.
The decision you make through your free will.
I think there is good content, actually. I think that one of the things that we encounter when we see this like intersection of the occult and capitalism is kind of a change in the role that the magician has in society. In the old days, in pre-capitalist times, when we were all serfs and we were all, mud farmers stuck in rural Germany or Czechoslovakia or the, northern France or whatever, people who studied the kind of stuff that we study would have been like the town wizard or the town cunning man or the town healer or diviner or whatever, and we would have been provided for because we would have been part of like a social structure, and that's not really around now.
Well, it's around, just not in the Western world.
Well, even in the Western world, you're like a Catholic priest, and you're just not. That's not cool. But yeah, you're right. It's not around in the Western world, but that's where we live.
Yeah. No, I've often lamented. I've been taught. Dominic knows I've been giving this spiel since I was a teenager. We don't have a place for the medicine man in Western culture, and so people who have a natural inclination toward that role from an early age are forced to have to find creative ways of living that role. Mm-hmm. You can't. There's a difference. I think that you can choose to become a magician, mm-hmm. Sorcerer, whatever. Well, sorcerer used to really be a pejorative term, but now it's become a super cool Dr. Strange term. But it's still kind of a lame thing, and kind of lame people.
I'm going to open my beer now. You mentioned Dr. Strange. I think it's time to open my beer.
Well, I love Dr. Strange. I love the character Dr. Strange.
Oh, me too.
Some people want to be sorcerers. So anyway, and I mean wannabe sorcerers. So, but anyway, it's just, you can, I think it's valid because that's kind of Mercury's whole thing. Fake it till you make it.
Mm-hmm.
I read a book, kind of a pamphlet, might have been more of a pamphlet, at some point by somebody who wrote under the name Magus Act, and I thought that was a good magician name, Magus Act, because it was like on one hand it's an injunction to act, to do, and on the other hand it's also admitting that it's an act, but it's an act that it's kind of like when you assume the God form.
Right.
It's very similar to acting. You know what I mean? Like anybody who's ever done any acting would be a natural at the assumption of the God form, because until the God form kicks in, until that divine influx occurs, you're acting the part, and I think that somebody can become a magician by acting the part, and they will eventually make some kind of contact with a deity or a spirit or their own weird and become that. But on the other hand, you have people who are born, and like Robert Cochran said, echoing Agrippa, true magicians are born, not made. The true witches are not made. And I do believe that. I think there's a qualitative distinction between somebody who gets into magic out of a desire for attention or money or power, which there's nothing inherently wrong with the desire for any of those things in themselves, but and somebody who is born as really a social outcast, because it's inherent to the role of the magician that there's a aspect of being an outsider. Yeah. And unless you've experienced that ostracism, that inherent, it's a natural ostracism, because it's not something where you're seeking it. It's something where you, from an early age, are pushed outside of the boundaries of the group, where you're the people in the group mind, they inherently sense an otherness, and you develop an awareness of that otherness as you age too, and it's there from an early age. That otherness is the quality that makes one a genuine shaman or magician or medicine man.
Yeah, I think I can see that. I'd like to actually step back a minute. You guys had mentioned that we don't have any Western version of a medicine man or shaman, and then I believe one of you mentioned Catholicism and priests, and that definitely is the Western version of a magician, in my opinion. Nowadays, I mean, Catholicism is sort of, kind of becoming cool again in the occult circles. You're seeing more occultists kind of turning back to Catholicism because it's so accessible, and they probably grew up in it. But yeah, I mean, the more you look into Catholicism on a deeper level, I mean, let's get away from the headlines and the pop culture.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very magical. I mean, the practice, what you're doing in the Mass is extremely magical.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I think one of the big differences is that a Catholic priest's role is kind of limited, right? Like a Catholic priest is in charge of sort of like the health and healing of the spiritual body, but not necessarily physical stuff. So you won't have a Catholic priest giving, sacrifice to make sure that the crops are good, or you won't go to the Catholic priest if you're like, I lost a thing and I need to find it, or, my cow broke its leg, or my cow isn't giving milk. Can you fix it with a magic spell or something? I think you had that role with like the Baal Shem, like the Jewish, the village rabbi wizard, might have had that role more, but I don't know that the Catholic priest has ever really held that position. I could be wrong. I might be a fool.
I think you do see that more in the Eastern churches. A little bit more folky stuff going on, where they're maybe blessing houses, blessing cars, doing different rituals in rivers, and things like that. But in Roman Catholicism, you may not see it as much. What are you doing?
Thanks, Janice. Okay, sorry.
Dominic,
Keep going, Dominic.
Rivers.
Yeah, something about a river. No, I do think you see a little bit more of that folky magic type stuff in the Eastern Church, more so than in the Roman Catholic Church that most people are familiar with.
Yeah, that could be. I'm really not very familiar with Eastern Church stuff, but I would totally believe that. Yeah. Okay.
Folk Catholicism, though, folk Catholicism, you do have priests doing things like that in some places.
Uh-huh.
I know in Italy there's a lot of folk Catholicism, and there are a lot of folk practices, and it may not always be the priest that's doing those things, but sometimes, and historically, you also had a lot of priests who were magicians. Of course, it's hilarious because 10 years ago, maybe 15, if I said Trithemius to most people who are interested in esotericism, they would have not known who I was talking about. But now you say Trithemius, and amazingly, tons of people know, which blows my mind because he wasn't a popular name back in the day, but he was a wizard bishop.
Hell yeah, he was.
So he's the most famous example. But there's also, in the northern. I was just talking about how in the northern countries there were several wizard bishops and priests, and like Gottschalk was one of them.
Well, wouldn't Saint Cyprian be an example of that?
Yeah, Cyprian is kind of a saint example of that. So the question is there a historical Cyprian of Antioch that actually existed? Well, maybe not. But the saint spirit. That spirit has an objective existence. But historically, was there an actual person? Who knows?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's definitely super popular these days. But there's. I'm trying to think now. I'm totally blanking on this because I don't really think about Catholic priests very often. But Trithemius is an incredible example, and he's definitely, I think, kind of an underappreciated figure in occult history. He was a teacher of Paracelsus and Agrippa. He was
crazy.
I know it's insane to think that Agrippa and Paracelsus were that closely connected, right? Like they learned from the same dude. And then Trithemius himself, like his most famous works have to do with steganography and cryptography. But even when you look at those, like his Steganographia, it looks like these demonic incantations. Filled with barbarous names and these weird things. But then when you look at it, inside the demonic incantations are like Middle German instructions for encoding secret messages in demonic incantations. It's super weird. Have you guys seen it?
I've seen pictures of the Steganographia, but I've never owned a copy of it.
I've got a copy of it. I'll show it to Dominic, and then he'll tell you about it, and you could be really.
That's great.
You could be jealous.
Well, what I wonder is, like, did Trithemius ever have a sit-down conversation with Paracelsus and say, like, hey man, like, listen, you really have got to stop pissing people off, or it's going to be your end. Like,
I don't know if he did,
because like he was famous for pissing people off.
Mm-hmm.
I think Agrippa was as well, right?
Yeah, but we also have letters from Trithemius to Agrippa, and they're in the intro to 3 books, which where he's basically writing to Agrippa and saying, like, don't publish this shit. Like, keep it under wraps. Do not... And I think he literally says something like, do not cast your pearls before swine. Like, I've taught you all of this strange occult knowledge, not so that you could put it into a book. Please don't do it. And Agrippa included that at the beginning of his book. Which is great, right? It basically, like, Trithemius, he did such a good job, like, staying under wraps, but then he has these 2 students who went on to become these famous cornerstones of occult knowledge. It's like,
yep.
Which just goes to show that even the greatest magician can be a ginormous fool.
There you go, bringing it all around.
Okay, I gotta ask, like, how did you guys meet each other? Like, how do you guys know each other?
We were both living in South Florida, and we just met in high school. We ran in the same kind of circles, which were basically the outcasts, misfits, pretty much of the school.
Like smoking dope and hailing Satan?
Yeah, the punk rockers and the goth kids and all that stuff. I don't remember exactly how we met, but we lived fairly close, and we somehow learned that we shared this interest in the occult, and that's what really kind of brought us together like magnets.
Mm-hmm.
We did a lot of stuff. We did a lot of experiments as teenagers together.
Not those kind of experiments. I mean, like magic experiments.
We're not talking about NetSack.
Right.
Or nutsack.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, we were, early teens, and we were, whatever books we could find. Back then, this is pre-internet, of course. And so the only stuff we had access to, really, unfortunately, I mean, it was great at the time, but there was a lot of Llewellyn stuff that we had access to, which,
yeah,
take what you can get. But, man, we were out there in the woods doing all sorts of stuff all the time.
We made like a mini Stonehenge out of wood, and we used to like skip school, and across from the school there was this abandoned water treatment plant with like acres of woods and plain and these dried up ponds with no water and like a clay base to them, and we made this like mini like kind of Stonehenge out of like fallen like trunks of like branches and trees. It was a weird place. There were all these like empty shells from turtles that had died, and so we were like drumming on the empty turtle shells in this like constructed like wood Stonehenge that we were skipping school to go do magic in. We were doing like shamanic journeying. We were invoking elemental kings, doing rune magic, going into trance, and like one person would go into trance and then the other person would record the visions, all kinds of stuff.
Wow. That's great. So, and then afterwards, after high school, you kind of like went to different parts of the country and...
I moved out to Pittsburgh for school. I went to school out there for a little bit, and Janice didn't have anything else going on, I guess, so he followed me out there, just because I probably...
Not really what happened.
He was probably worried about you. He's like, I better follow this guy and make sure everything's okay.
No. Here's the true story. See, I wanted to get out to Florida, but Dominic was like, "Oh man, Pittsburgh is great. You got to come up here. It's so awesome." It's like because our families are both from the East Coast, so we used to talk about like, how it was way cooler up north when we were in Florida and stuff as kids. He's like, "Oh, you got to come up here. You got to come up here. It's so great. There's an occult shop. There's all this cool stuff." Really, he was actually lying and exaggerating because he was bored.
Well,
I got up there. What is this shithole city? And but I was there, so I moved up there, and we had a lot of fun. Then he moved away, and I got stuck here.
Oh, well, sorry. It's the pits.
It's the pits. But in all honesty, Pittsburgh was pretty cool when you're coming from South Florida, because like he had mentioned, we were both from the Northeast, and we missed a lot of that Northeast. The food, there's a lot that you miss when you're down in Florida. A lot of people down in Florida are from somewhere else. But Pittsburgh is kind of a dump at times and in certain areas. But like you said, Janice, we did have fun. We continued our magical exploits in Pittsburgh, and man, it was we weren't exactly in the right mindset. There was a lot of dark stuff going on.
Well, we were by this point we were like we were reading like like
The Darkness.
like Kenneth Grant and
Oh yeah,
TOS.
right.
And
That
we were still into shamanistic stuff, and we had kind of moved up into like ceremonial magic plus shamanism plus entheogens plus
mm-hmm.
like
entheogens.
Entheogens.
Typhonian experiments.
Sure.
A lot of mistakes, but we were still young. We were actually underage still. So
that was the phase of your life where you were convinced that you were all magician and no fool.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it, that the fool almost comes after the magician. Like in terms of awareness, right? You start off thinking like I'm a fool, then you jump really quickly into I'm a magician when you're really still the fool. And then by the time that you're aware that you're the fool, you're probably more of a magician than you ever were when you were certain that you were a magician, but still completely a fool.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
You hit the nail on the head with that. I mean, so I'm not going to get into some of the foolish stuff, but yeah, that was a fool period.
Yeah, the difficulty of it continues because I think that once you recognize the fool element in you, you also recognize how important the fool is to growth. So sometimes you still have to be like, oh shit, and that's the Hanged Man. Oh god, okay, sorry, I just had like a tarot revelation. No, but so eventually you have to, you, as you gain experience and you get wiser and wiser and wiser, and you're sort of like, okay, I'm still always going to be the fool. I'm never going to be completely comfortable with all this stuff, and you get better and better at stuff. And then at some point you're like, I'm not progressing anymore. I have to do something foolish in order to get to the next step of knowledge. Right? So the Hanged Man is totally like realizing you gotta do the fool. You gotta like force yourself to be a fool. Do something.
You have to always have that empty cup mentality.
Yep.
I mean, if your cup is full at all times, that's it.
Yeah.
It's done. You've always got to have that idea of being that empty cup at all times.
Yeah.
And I think the next aspect of like there's always this like, fool like into dark, powerful. You know what I mean? Like there's a full aspect of the underworld side of things where it's attractive to the immature, the inexperienced, the spooky. And that's okay if you start there. Like J.K. Huysmans wrote in the book, I think it was in La Basse, he wrote about how in that book is about like, fin de siècle occultism, especially fin de siècle Satanism, like 18th, 19th century France, or 17th, and he said something like, I didn't realize or I didn't experience supernatural good until I had gone into supernatural evil. Like it was going into supernatural evil that brought him to awareness of the supernatural light. And I could say that was the case for me too. It was like radical confrontation with genuinely cosmic evil, you could say, somehow broke my mind free from it, and I saw the light of the truth, of the good, the beautiful, and the true. And I mean, when I say saw it, I mean it literally saw it.
Mm-hmm. I saw you nodding a lot, Dominic. Do you agree?
Oh yeah, I mean, I know what he's talking about. He's kind of he's not going into great detail, but it's reminiscent of the kind of the divine descent in order to ascend. So you know, at least in a lot of Neoplatonic thought, you must fully descend, kind of like a yo-yo. So the yo-yo has to go all the way down to the bottom before it comes back up, and so. Orpheus
had to do the same thing, right? Like he didn't get translated into the heavens until he descended into the underworld and failed horribly.
Right. So yeah, I mean that's some of those experiences that you have as the fool when you're younger, going into the kind of cool, dark, stuff, it can be very scarring and damaging. But I think maybe as a magician, it's useful in a way so that you can, like Janice was saying, then you can ascend out of there. Because you know what's down there, you've experienced it, you've lived it, and you know that's not the end-all, be-all.
Well, it's scary as hell when you're there.
Yeah, I would agree.
But you have to view it with equanimity. You know what I mean? Like, you have to, you learn, it teaches you a sort of non-attachment. Even when you first just experience anything, when you first experience the reality of spirits, not I'm going to have an altar and I'm going to have these pretty things on it and I'm going to, I'm going to invoke a god and blah, blah, blah. But when you really experience some of these beings, when you realize that you're in this, engaged with something that is genuinely a separate intelligence than yourself.
And then it just scares the shit out of you.
It does.
Yeah.
And also cuts you down to size.
Yeah.
It's
that the magician fool oscillation again, isn't it? It's the thing where you get up there and you're sort of like, oh shit, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. Or,
yeah, that's true.
Or what the hell have I done?
I bet. Yeah.
So tell me about your decision to start the podcast. How did that come about? Whose idea was it?
It was Dom's.
Yeah, it was my idea. We had, throughout the years, we have continued I live on the West Coast now, but we continued, our conversations and our relationship. And I was going through a period where I was doing a lot of devotional stuff with Hermes. I did a particular thing where it was like 40 days. There was a lot of fasting, 40 days straight of ritual to Hermes. And during that time, and of course Hermes is associated with communication. And during a few of those episodes, a few of those rituals, I just got the idea of, how do I transform this Hermes energy into my life? How do I bring this into my life? And I thought maybe a book, something like that. But then the idea of doing a podcast, because Janice and I would talk regularly anyway, and our conversations would sometimes just be an hour, 2 hours of just talking about esoteric stuff. So I thought, man, why don't we just record it? Let's just do a podcast, and this would be kind of a tribute to Hermes in a way, because then we would be communicating to others as well, and hopefully bringing some insight, bringing some kind of illumination to people that maybe were in the dark about something. So that was the thought.
But then, so most of your episodes, however, in fact, maybe all of them have had a guest.
Yeah, and that wasn't really the plan at the beginning, which is funny. Yeah, we started the first few episodes were just us going back and forth. And then we had a guest on because he was very knowledgeable. We did two Simon Magus episodes, and we thought, well, let's bring this guy in. He was a friend, and he knows a lot about Simon Magus, so that's cool. And we just liked how it turned out, and then we thought, oh, well, let's bring this guy on. And then that led to, oh, let's bring this guy on. And yeah, it just kind of evolved that way.
You've had some...
But we try and keep it kind of like conversations with friends. Like,
yeah.
We definitely aim for a deeper level when it comes to the questions we ask and the dimensions of the conversation. But we try and keep it also like friends that are hanging out with each other, and you're kind of like sitting in with that.
Yeah,
and that's what you do too, Erik. I mean, that's what your podcast is kind of all about.
I tried to do that. I like that. I think that and that's something I really appreciate about your guys' podcast. Like, it feels like you get into very easy conversation with your guests, and sometimes I think it's good to have more of a conversation than an interview. I don't get as much out of just asking you guys questions without having my feedback to them, right? Like, that makes it better.
Yeah.
I really only had one question to ask you guys before we got into this. I was like, I'm just gonna start with a joke and see how it goes. And
well, I love it. I mean, I wish I could do that, but I'm kind of the opposite. I've got a whole list of questions and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But we've been also very lucky that all of our guests are talkers.
Yeah.
And that helps. All of our guests they're so passionate about the topics that they're specialized in that they just love talking about it, and that makes our job easier for sure.
It's so hard to pick even a favorite because all the interviews, all the conversations have been fantastic. I mean, we just feel so honored that they even agreed to talk to us.
Mm-hmm.
But each one has been like, we end up walking away feeling like we made a new friend or deepened an existing friendship.
Yeah, the last episode of yours, it might be your latest one, I'm not sure, Marcus McCoy.
Yeah.
So I had already downloaded it, and I was going to listen to it, and a really close friend of mine texted me. He's like, hey, a good buddy of mine from high school was on this podcast. You're totally going to love it. And he sent me a link to the Marcus McCoy episode. I was like, oh, yeah. I was just about to start listening to that.
That's hilarious. It's funny, too, because... Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, you keep going.
I was just going to say, all of our guests have almost guided the direction of my spiritual practice as well. I mean, in different directions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, each one of our guests has brought up something that was kind of like a light bulb going off, like, oh my God, yes.
Yeah.
And I integrate that into my practice, and then our next guest says something amazing, and it's like, oh man, I start to steer in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
So it's funny how all of our interviews have kind of flowed into each other, and selfishly, it's almost just an extension of my practice and Janice's practice. We're getting guests on that we want to talk to because we're interested in them, and that's what kind of what we're doing currently.
I think.
And I mean, we venerate Hermes. I mean,
mm-hmm.
When it comes to talking about a direct contact, genuine experience, both Hermes Mercurius the God exists, the God lives, and it's not just an energy, it's not just a consciousness, it's a person. I mean, he's real, and he is amazing,
mm-hmm.
and he's great, and he's vivid, and he's fast, and he's compassionate, and he's really the reason all of that's happening. And we have I venerate him very consistently on a regular basis, and so does and Dominic does too. And I really feel like the reason this is going so well, and the reason things have gone so well, is really due to his influence, really due to his spirit sort of suffusing the conversations with grace, because ultimately it is all in his name,
mm-hmm.
and in his honor, because he's given us so much, and we're very grateful for that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I have a response to what both of you said. Like, first of all, like, Dominic, when you're talking about like the podcast almost becoming part of your practice, like, I think that's really valuable. I think that there's a couple things that are really interesting about that. First of all, you're not always going to be bringing on people that you agree with, but that doesn't mean that you can't learn from them, right? And I've had that same experience where I've interviewed folks and changed my practice after talking to them. And then the other thing, like, Janice, I have the same kind of interaction with Hermes. You can see my altar in the background here, like right above my finger. I know there's a lot of glare, but that's a picture of Hermes Trismegistus that was painted by a Russian icon painter for me, probably like 10 or so years ago. I had a bunch of extra money.
I would really like to see that. Really like to see that.
I will.
Same here.
I will get you guys a good picture of it. It's basically like the centerpiece of my altar, and so I do this. When I pray in the mornings, I pray to the one beyond Hermes, but still, like, there's this picture of Hermes Trismegistus staring me right in the face while I'm doing it. And so, I think, it would be interesting to see how many occult podcasters have a Hermes-centric practice going on. I suspect it's a ton of them.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
It does. And really, isn't it Trithemius who spoke about there's going to be a $250 workshop on this after I say this. But,
hold on, let me take notes.
Wasn't it Trithemius? I think it might also be in the Almadel that spoke about the angels governing the world ages, and currently we're in the age of Ophiel, and
right.
And if you look at it, it makes perfect sense because during the age of Ophiel, communications technology developed at a rapid rate and has exponentially increased in its complexity. Communication in general has spread across the world at lightning speed, and then on top of that, the availability of information has exploded. There's also a lot of gender ambiguity where there didn't used to be. There's issues of information theft, pirating. These are all really hermetic concepts. All these things, the liminality, the thievery, the availability of information, the explosion of interest in the occult, the communications, these are all hermetic. These are all qualities of Hermes. And we're really in the age of Hermes, of Mercury. Really, I subscribe to I think there are multiple ages occurring at any given moment. There's multiple sort of circles of overlap of different ages that are interpenetrating depending on the paradigm that you're operating within. But
so we're having the Kali Hermes Yuga 12th world.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Aquarius, but we're really on that Aquarius Pisces transition point. But Mercury's exalted Aquarius.
Oh.
So we have, and the waves of Aquarius are electrical waves. They're not water. They're sound. So there's that, Uranian, Luciferian, Promethean, Hermetic characteristic to this age, and which is by nature double in the same way that Hermes has the celestial and chthonic aspects to him. And I just think that if you look at it that way, it's kind of interesting. But yeah, I didn't realize that was an image of Hermes over the altar, but I'm not surprised. I don't want to seem like a Jesus freak, even though I love Jesus, and I think there's no shame in that. But I would also, and I'm a freak, freak, but that's a Ram LZ shout out. But anyway, it's interesting because I would shout to the hills about how amazing Hermes is because I love him. He's incredible, and he's given so many wonderful things in my life, and he's benefited me in so many ways, and he's taught me so much. And I hate to sound like that because I also don't do that because of the humility aspect, and also because of an unfortunate shadow of modern esoteric culture. And I think really occulture is an oxymoronical term because occult means hidden, and it should be done in silence and in secrecy to some degree. But a shadow side of it is LARPing, where you have
I was thinking about that this morning.
Yeah, and let me qualify that. If I don't mean people who just LARP, and that's cool. If you're into LARPing, that's fine. If that makes you happy. But I mean the people who pretend they're magicians and wizards and witches, Like really, all the Instagram witches, bar probably like 3 people, are really just LARPers.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Or the YouTube witches.
Right.
Yeah, it's like an aesthetic or a lifestyle, where you set up photo shoots and I but at the same time,
I know I hate to be the positive one here, but at the same time, that we all go through those phases that are immature and foolish and faulty, and maybe just maybe some of those YouTube LARPing witches will, maybe that will lead into something bigger and better.
Some of them,
we can only hope.
Some of them definitely will, right? Like there's always going to be, somebody will always sort of come out of it and be like, oh shit, I just realized something, and they will go on to do something bigger and better. And I guess, it's, we grew up in a time where we didn't have the ability to expose ourselves to the entire world that way, but we might have,
right,
if we'd had the opportunity.
Yeah, it's very possible.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking of it this way too. Like, so this is creating a culture, right? Well, what is a culture? What is a culture in the scientific sense? A culture, things are grown within a culture.
Yeah.
So a rich culture or saturated culture is a firm. It's a really useful substance to grow things from. So yes, you're going to have more elementary aspects in a saturated culture, but you also have more potential for complexity and development and evolution within a culture that has many elements and is hypersaturated. Whereas a sparse culture with very little, it's harder to grow something within that, within a laboratory, within a chemical sense of culture. And I usually think of culture as or like a ferment, you need those basic elements in the ferment to initiate that fermentation.
That's an interesting thought. And I can't imagine what it would be like nowadays. Like I said earlier, when we were growing up, all we had was the bookstore, and whatever the bookstore had on hand, that's what you get, or the library, I guess. But nowadays, man, I have all of the Gnostic Gospels at my fingertips. I have, pretty much anything I want at my fingertips on the internet, and I can't even imagine having that when I was younger, in my teens. And the blessing and a curse, maybe, I don't know. I mean, it was probably good for us to have a sparse amount of material available, because it really forced us to dig and work. But at the same time, there's probably more chances to go off track because you didn't know. You just don't know what you don't know. And nowadays, you pretty much can know whatever you want at any time.
You can also easily know what you don't know at any time with a Google search, and just feel like,
right.
Like, holy shit, there's a lot of stuff to read about this.
Right. Well, it also is like part of what helps you to get to that point where you experience something genuine, or where you make something genuine happen, is kind of this extreme attitude of pushing yourself, of extreme experimentation, of diligence, and keeping trying something. It reminds me of there used to be this in the late 90s, from the maybe early mid 90s to the early 2000s, there was this interesting culture which was I don't know if it was overseas as much as in America, but there was this culture where it was post-industrial music, Temple of Psychic Youth, chaos magic. There were people that were kind of itinerant, would travel around. Bands like Crash Worship, Zev, just even Psychic TV, if you want to name a more well-known version. I
think that was the 80s.
Well, 80s into the 90s, but in the 90s it started becoming even more cohesive, this culture. And I was also kind of active within that culture in my late teens, and knew a lot of people in it, and met some really cool people. Like, we all know Arun or Zygote, and
wait, you know Arun also?
Yeah.
How does everybody know Arun?
When I was 17.
He's an awesome dude.
He's a great person. I met him and his at the time roommate Joel back in '97, and we did magic together, and and had long conversations about magic and burrows, and all this different, beat poetry, chaos magic, tribalism, post-industrial music, all this. It was like a kind of an egregore at the time. Topi, Temple. I mean, Arun in 1997 he was printing off. He worked at Kinko's and was like secretly printing off like the Gray Book and like in the middle of the night and like distributing it. Like that's.
I love
he's
that.
Always been hard. Yeah, he's amazing.
Have you guys had him on your podcast yet?
No, but we're going to.
Maybe we should have a race. you up for a challenge?
Oh. You might have a leg up on us, so we're in Portland.
Well, Dom's in Portland.
Oh yeah, I forget.
I think it would be great if both of us had him on the podcast, because he is just such a fountain of knowledge. I mean, he's the real deal. I mean, he's been doing this for decades, and he really goes all out. 100%.
I've been doing this. Okay, let's do a crossover episode, right?
I'm into that.
Yeah.
And he's a perfect example of a magician. Like, he's totally, he's not an internet celebrity.
No.
He's not a blog magician. But he's out there in the trenches doing magic every single fucking day.
Oh yeah. And he's way into like Greek magical papyri stuff, and he's doing stuff where, he tells me about it and I'm just sort of like, oh shit, I should have been doing that like a year ago. Why am I such a slacker?
Well, it's great motivation to have a friend like that. I mean, he motivates me when I read some of the stuff that he's doing. It's like, oh man, I need to pick it up. I need to turn it up a notch.
Yeah, I get that same feeling from him, but
But that's what you have to be with magic. You have to be like obsessive. You have to be like incessant. You have to be just constantly experimenting, constantly trying, constantly doing. And for me, being this like kid who was really like, besides Dominic and my friend Jamie Dunkel, who is also a pretty amazing magician, who also knows him, lives in Portland. Besides them though, who were both on different sides of the country at that point, I didn't really know anybody in where I was living. So I went, so at the time I went from Florida to Portland. I think it was like 16. And, so to meet these people that were into magic and were as passionate about it as I was, this is pre-internet age, really. I mean, the internet was there, but it was really like a dinosaur at the time. So it was really inspiring. And now I think it's really good that kids who have that natural impulse can find people not only in their city, but all over the world who they can talk to and learn stuff from. So the positive side of it is, there's a lot of opportunity for growth. And I don't want to put young people, or even not so young people, who are just admitting to themselves or feeling like it's okay to be interested in these things. Because you know what else it means? With the interest comes the money. And that means funding for people translating old texts. That means money for really talented people to publish books that really should be out there to counter the, airy-fairy stuff. It means resources that are now available, which means the potential of an actual evolution of ideas, practices, and it's great. I mean, look at this. I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with the internet, and every day I think about how I might just unplug from all of it. But it's still pretty cool that you can get on a discussion group about a totally specific magical topic with people that are passionate about it, and everybody's trying these things and inspiring each other. Like, that's cool. I wish I had that when I was 16.
Yeah, and let's also, I feel like after all of our disparaging comments at the beginning of the conversation, we should point out that it is okay to give magicians money.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, buying an internet course is way different than, like, funding somebody's research. Sometimes you can help a fellow magician or a way nerdier magician, like, dig into stuff that you don't have time to understand, or help translate something that you can't do. Like, there's a dude on Patreon who's working on translating Abraham Abulafia's stuff, and as he goes through it, he's like, I don't have money to do this on my own. If you fund me, I'll give you these meditations as I translate them. And it's like, that's fucking awesome.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I do think
there's definitely a positive side.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. Because,
why shouldn't you pay somebody who's, say, like you said, translating something that you actually need or want,
mm-hmm.
or who's doing work that you're going to benefit from?
Yeah.
That's an entirely, and you know what? The fact is, I'm not going to name names here.
Yeah, but don't name names. Those of
They
us
might
who
be
are around
yes.
know the names.
But that's the side of Hermes too.
Yeah.
Hustlers.
It is. It is.
Hustlers. Money hustlers, magicians who are money hustlers. It's kind of like the true prophets versus false prophets.
Mm-hmm.
The two sides of Mercury. And I'm not saying that those things are created by Mercury, but they're part of the paradigm. For every genuine person you have, you're going to have 5 imitators. And it's part of the transition of the Royal Road of the Tarot, is the development from starting off as the Fool and then moving through the degrees of development. Really, you have those 3 magicians in the Tarot. You have, besides the Fool, who's outside of the sequence, you have the Magician, but then you have the Hermit, and you also have the Hierophant. And really, all 3 of them are the 3 Magi. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Typically speaking.
Maybe. I don't know that it's necessarily limited to that, though. I think that, all 3 of those are kind of in the lower half of the tarot. The Hermit is, what, 9? 10?
Yeah.
Yeah. But even past that, like, you have development that involves a lot of individuality and change and stuff. The Hierophant, I think in particular, doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot without being balanced by the High Priestess, where they both are sort of like gatekeepers, just to different realms of knowledge. But then when you get above into like the gnarly tarot, the gnarly major arcana, like the Hanged Man is totally a magician. Death is totally, or not death. Well, maybe death is a magician too, but like the devil is absolutely a magician, because the devil is totally about like the material bindings. Like when you suddenly discover the fact that you can affect the material world, how do you not get stuck in the devil card? Like the magician is manifold? Does manifold mean what I think it means? I'm going to say multifaceted. Wait, does manifold mean what I think? I'm going to have to look that up.
Yeah, you're right. Well, the devil is a mask that the magician can wear. The thing is, those are all masks. Each character of the tarot is a mask of that the magician should be able to wear.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think in terms of developmental phases, the Hierophant, the Hermit, and the Magician are all like points on the journey specifically related to the development of esoteric qualities. I think if a magician is able to pass through each one of those roles and learn them, they become very well-rounded. Because one relates to the individual magician in an active way. The other relates to the magician's relationship with the divine. Whether that's polytheistic or monotheistic is sort of irrelevant. It's the relationship with the divine in the Hierophant. And also the magician as teacher, I guess you could say. And then the hermit, of course, is the magician as the hermit or monk or mystic who's withdrawn from the world. I mean, you see in the story of Jesus and in the story of the Buddha, or Shakyamuni Buddha, I should say, the same those three milestones there, and I think they're important because whereas the magician is totally active, the hermit is in a totally inactive state. Is withdrawn.
Yeah, the hermit isn't even really receptive, right? Like the hermit is just cut off. Perhaps. Is that how you would? Oh no.
Personally, I think the hermit is very receptive, and that's why they become a hermit. They withdraw from the external influences of society and culture and go out into the wilderness. I read a great biography on a Thai Kamatana Bhikkhu monk, a forest monk. They're basically hermits that live in the rainforest. And his name was Acharya Moon. And Acharya Moon, I mean, he meditated so hardcore, his teeth fell out. He had no flesh on his body. But he was extremely ascetic. But his biography is incredible. And he talks about interacting with with nagas rather, communicating with animals, interacting with the dead. And he's talking about these things in this totally matter-of-fact way, so he was a complete hermit. He lived in a cave. He completely avoided people whenever he could, in every way that he could. But he's sitting there, he's interacting with spirits, he's interacting with animals, he's interacting with the dead. He's having these essential magical experiences that you can only have when you go out into the wilderness and you abandon. And that's that otherness that I think is necessary. And if you look at the Hierophant, he's almost the counterpoint to that, because the Hierophant is really, really engaged and really involved with others. And then the magician is kind of somewhere in between.
I guess I always...
you can see that. Oh, sorry.
No, go, Dom.
I mean, you could see that. I mean, Jesus in the wilderness for 40 days. He was definitely the hermit at that point, and that was maybe a period of kenosis where he was just receiving. And then later, when he emerged from the wilderness, is when he maybe changed from the hermit to maybe not quite, maybe the magician at that point, and then later from there, maybe moved on to the Hierophant. So it might also be a progression of yourself as well.
I guess I would think that, so you're right about the Hierophant being receptive, but the Hierophant is more, the hermit being receptive, but the hermit is receptive to divine influence and not worldly influence, whereas the Hierophant, I think, acts as a gatekeeper between the material and the divine, or the material and the non-material. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah, I
think that's true.
All right, because you can't nod on a podcast.
Yeah, I think kind of a responsibility of a magician, even if it's just a responsibility to yourself, is to move beyond being the hermit and engage in the world. You have to use the lessons you've learned maybe as the hermit and bring them into your worldly practice. Like maybe in the Lord's Prayer, you see basically as above, so below. You have to embody the lessons that you've learned as maybe the hermit. And maybe it's not always about you, and you're bringing those lessons to other people at this point.
Yeah.
And that's maybe where the Hierophant is.
Yeah.
I think the aspect of with the Hierophant that I want to get out there real quickly, too, is that they're a custodian of tradition. The magician is free to act as he wills, as he chooses, but the Hierophant is holding something sacred with them. They're keeping something sacred, and so I think there's a lot of Hierophant hate out there. Oh, he's patriarchy, blah blah blah. But like, that's not really the Hierophant. You know, every card has a shadow side, but really the Hierophant is he's holding, like the High Priestess. He's gatekeeping, but he's also the custodian of something very sacred.
Yeah.
Contact with the divine. And so the conservatism of the Hierophant is a necessity because they're preserving things that have been handed down from antiquity. And so there's a sense of responsibility that ends up being on the shoulders of the Hierophant, where there's a sense of, you know, the freedom to be irresponsible with the magician. And sort of, you could almost see any responsibility in the hermit too, because they're like, fuck this, I'm getting out of here, I'm done with this bullshit, you know what I mean, I'm getting away from everyone and everything, I'm going to go hang out, realize the monad, you know what I mean?
Where do I sign up?
I ask myself that every day.
Step 1, never ever move to a city. You guys, it's been a pleasure to finally get to talk to both of you.
Thanks for your patience. I tried really hard to sabotage this.
You did, but you know, you can't sabotage another fool. But can you tell the audience a little bit about your podcast and where to find it and stuff, or where to find you guys, if there's anything you want them to know about?
Yeah, sure. And again, just thank you, Erik. It's fun talking to you. I feel like we
it was a
keep
great
going
conversation.
As far as finding us, though, Facebook's definitely the easiest place if people want to contact us or look at what we're doing. We post our episodes on Facebook, but
it's The Magician and the Fool.
Magician and the Fool podcast, maybe that's what it's called. And we also have a website, themagicianandthefool.podbean.com.
Okay, great.
That's pretty much it.
We're on Stitcher, you know,
Probably iTunes,
Google Play, Apple Play.
Yeah, all the usual places.
YouTube,
Yeah.
Yep.
Also, we also participate in a group called the Hermetic Federation, and the aim of the Hermetic Federation is the exploration and transmitting and practice of traditional Hermetism. And I know that's something that is also important to you. I would really like it if you wanted to start. I mean, it'd be awesome.
I would love to start a lodge in Portland. I think that'd be great. And
oh, really?
You know,
okay.
Mostly the most hermetic thing that I've got. Well, so I mean, my Masonic lodge is very esoteric, but also probably aside from that, brunch. You know, which is a Portland tradition, but our brunches in particular are especially weird.
I mean, lunch is a tradition everywhere. A brunch is a tradition in every city.
Yeah, but Portland's brunches are special.
Portland takes it to the next level. Yeah.
No, you're right. I forgot about that. I lived in Portland, by the way.
Yeah. Well, come back.
Well, I would love to.
Thank you for listening to My Alchemical Bromance. You can find us on the web at myalchemicalbromance.com. You can find us on Stitcher and iTunes and YouTube and maybe Spotify. You can support us if you'd like to. In fact, we would love for you to support us through the Arnemancy Patreon. You can find a link in the show notes or on the website. It's patreon.com/Arnemancy for just $1 a month. Tune in next time and see you soon.